Edith Piaf walked into a Paris recording studio in 1947 with a musician nobody had heard of. She sat down and told the producer she would not record until he was in the room. The producer said no. She said nothing. She waited. The musician was a young accordion player, not unknown in the specific circles where accordion players were known, but not someone whose name carried any weight in the world of the major Paris recording studios, where the decisions about who appeared on what sessions were made by people whose criteria had very little to do with talent and a great deal to do with reputation, relationship, and the specific economy of who owed what to whom. He was, in the language of that world, unproven. And in the Paris recording world of the late 1940s, unproven was a category that carried almost no purchasing power. Edith Piaf was not unproven. She was, by 1947, one of the most commercially significant artists in the French recording industry, with a body of recorded work that had established her voice as a known and reliable draw, and with a relationship to her label that gave her a degree of influence that most performers of her generation could not access. This influence was not unlimited. Recording decisions were made by producers and label executives who had their own priorities, and who did not, as a general practice, accept the artistic preferences of performing artists as binding, but it was real. And on this particular afternoon, in this particular studio, she chose to use it in a specific and direct way. She told them the musician was on the session. When the producer objected, she did not argue. She did not explain her reasoning, or lobby, or appeal to any authority above the producer's own. She sat down, and she waited. To understand why this moment mattered, and why the story of it has been preserved in the accounts of the people who were in that building, you have to understand what it meant, in the Paris of that era, for a performer of Piaf's stature to make a demand of this kind on behalf of someone who had no standing to make demands of their own. She was using the only tool available to her that could override the producer's practical objections: the fact that without her, the session could not proceed, and that the session not proceeding was a cost that the label was not prepared to absorb. She sat. She waited. The producer stood with his objection, and she remained in the chair, and the session did not begin. The accounts of how long this standoff lasted vary in the way that accounts of waiting tend to vary, because waiting is not a thing that is accurately tracked by the people doing it, particularly when what they are waiting for is uncertain. What the accounts agree on is that the standoff was resolved by the producer's decision to allow the musician to participate, and that this decision was arrived at not through any change in Piaf's position or any argument she made, but through the simple mathematics of a situation in which the cost of continuing to refuse had become higher than the cost of conceding. The musician came in. The session proceeded. What was recorded that afternoon has not been identified with certainty in any publicly available account. The specific song, the specific arrangements, the specific contribution the accordion player made to what ended up on tape. What has been preserved is the fact of the session and the fact of the standoff, and the way the people who were in the building that day described the quality of the recording that came out of it. They described it in the terms that people use when they are trying to say that something exceeded their expectations in a way they had not anticipated, that the session had produced something better than what would have been produced without the change that had been forced upon it. In the years that followed that session, Piaf continued to make musical decisions with the same directness she had used in that studio. She was known, among the producers and arrangers who worked with her regularly, as a performer who had specific ideas about what her recordings needed and who was not easily moved off those ideas by arguments that were purely procedural. The session of 1947 was one instance of this pattern, and it was remembered as such by the people who had been in the room, not because it was the most dramatic instance, but because it was one of the clearest illustrations of what the pattern looked like when it was expressed in its most direct and unambiguous form. The Paris music industry in the late 1940s was not a meritocracy, in the sense that talent alone was not a sufficient condition for the opportunities that talent required in order to become visible. The studios where the major recordings were made were controlled by a relatively small number of producers and label executives who had developed over years a set of preferences about who they worked with and how sessions were assembled. These preferences were not arbitrary. They were based on experience and on a practical understanding of how sessions needed to run in order to be productive and economically viable. But they were also conservative in the way that preferences always become conservative when they have been working well enough for long enough, resistant to new elements that had not yet demonstrated their value by the standards the system had developed to measure it. New musicians entered this world through a series of gatekeeping encounters, auditions, sessions, recommendations, the gradual building of a track record that gave the producers and arrangers who controlled access to major sessions a reason to include them. The process was not fast, and it was not guaranteed, and for every musician who navigated it successfully, there were many others who did not, whose talent was never connected to the opportunity that would have made it visible. The accordion player that Piaf brought to that studio had come to her attention through channels that the preserved accounts do not describe with great precision. What they describe is that she had heard him play, that she had formed a clear opinion about what she had heard, and that she had decided, with the directness that characterized the way she made decisions about her music, that he belonged on the session she was about to record. This was not a sentimental decision. It was a musical judgment made by a person who had spent years developing the capacity to make such judgments, and who had enough confidence in that capacity to act on it against the resistance of people with more institutional authority. The producer who objected was not objecting from malice. He was operating within the normal parameters of how studio sessions were organized. The roster had been set, the arrangements had been prepared for the musicians who were booked, and the introduction of an unscheduled and unknown player into the session disrupted the orderly process by which his job was supposed to proceed. His objection was practical and procedural, and it was not unreasonable on its own terms. Piaf's response was not reasonable on procedural terms. She was not operating within the expectations that the studio had of the artists who came through it, even the significant ones. The expectation was that even performers with considerable standing would, in the final analysis, defer to the practical authority of the producer on questions of session composition, that they would make their preferences known through the normal channels of request and discussion, and would accept the producer's final word as what it was, the final word. This was the expectation. Piaf's behavior on that afternoon was a clear and uncomplicated departure from it, and the people in the room recognized it as such the moment she sat down and said nothing more. Piaf did not describe the incident in any detailed way in the accounts she gave of her working life. She was not, by temperament, a person who narrated her own advocacy on behalf of other people. She did not present herself as someone who fought battles, and she did not use the language of battles to describe what had happened in that studio. What she said, in the oblique forms in which she sometimes referenced decisions she had made about her music, was consistent with a view that the recording had needed what she had brought to it, and that the producer's initial resistance had not changed this fact. There is a particular form of authority that does not announce itself, that does not argue its case or make its reasoning explicit, but that operates through the simple refusal to accept that the case needs making. Piaf's Sitting Down and Waiting in that studio in 1947 was not a performance of authority. It was authority itself, used on behalf of someone who had none, in a room where the person with the most power had decided to exercise it in the direction of the person with the least. She had not done it to be remembered for doing it. She had done it because the session needed the musician, and the musician needed the session, and she was the only person in that building who had both the capacity to see this clearly and the leverage to act on it. When the producer conceded, she did not mark the concession as a victory. She simply moved to the microphone and began to work. What the tape produced was a recording made under conditions that had been shaped by a single act of will, the will of a performer who understood what her music needed and who had been willing to make that understanding visible in the most uncomplicated way possible, by refusing to begin until it was honored. The recording existed because she had been willing to sit in a chair and say nothing until the room understood that she meant what she had said. This was not a large gesture in the physical sense. It was one of the smallest gestures available to a person, sitting still. But sitting still, when you are the reason the room cannot proceed, is a form of speech that requires no words and that cannot be easily misunderstood. She had spoken. The room had listened. The musician played, and the tape ran. This is what authority looks like when it is used for something other than itself. Not a proclamation, not a demand, not a performance of power. A chair, and the silence of someone who has decided to occupy it until the room comes around to what was always true.